Elizabeth Kasande. I'm the program coordinator at International Development Institute in Washington. So today we have a webinar, which I'm glad you all attended. And with me, I have our Executive Director, Mr. Tinshina, who will introduce our speaker and we'll get into the discussion. I encourage you to, while the speaker is speaking, please put your mic on mute. If you have questions, you can type them in the chat box or raise your hand. We'll first have a discussion and we'll open room for questions. Go ahead, Suman. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. And that's the beauty of this pandemic, that we are all connected in certain time zone from around the world. And I just wanted to introduce ourselves first. We are a training and capacity building organization based in Washington, DC. And we provide a number of training programs, and a few of the very popular ones are for financial institutions, for public procurement, monitoring and evaluation, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a school leadership program. So these programs are going on every quarter. So David has been a long affiliate with us and a good friend. So David and I have been talking about starting a new training program or workshop for PPP. So we are designing. David is taking a lead, and we're going to reach out to all of you. Look out for your email for our future training program for PPP, hopefully from June or so. So you'll get plenty of time to plan it. And many times the employer sponsor participants, many times the donor agencies from the country sponsor. So participation has been very good on Zoom. And those training programs are usually 2 to 3 hours long per day for 5 to 10 days, depending on which program it is. And Elizabeth is point of contact. She will reach out to you. Meanwhile, we are collecting some survey. We are doing some survey, collecting interest from people that what kind of topic they are interested in. So if you get those surveys from Elizabeth or someone from IDI, please respond, because those data really help us move forward. So without further delay, I just want to introduce our participant that you guys have signed up to come and listen to. David, I call him the poster boy of PPP. He is, no matter what you talk about PPP, in these days, dialogue or discussion is incomplete without his name. Many of you have probably met him, listened to him, or read his blog or articles. And he has been associated with many organizations around the world, in Africa, North and Central America, Latin America, Middle East, Asia, you name it. And he has worked with USAID, MCC, ADB, World Bank, African Development Bank, Dutch Ministry, etc. And just recently, I believe last week, I'll let David talk more about it. So I think last week, his blog was ranked as like one of the most read blogs by World Bank, and they were all on PPP. And if you haven't followed, and if you have an interest, I suggest you do so. So with that, we have about 102 people registered for this event from about 14 countries. So look out for the friends, each other online here. So David, all yours, and you can go ahead and share your screen, etc. Okay. If I miss anything, David, you can just add it up.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening, where you're located. It's always wonderful to do these international events. For those who don't know it, I am originally South African, and I consider myself a son of Africa, and I've lived and worked there most of my life. So one of the things that I'm always very, very concerned about, especially in Africa, but also other emerging economies, is helping them to find ways to promote sustainable and resilient development. And the area that I'm involved in, obviously, is public-private partnerships, but it's also generally procurement and development, because PPPs are really a delivery mechanism to deliver projects where there's stronger partnerships between the public and private sector. The one thing I do want to say before I start the slide, there are many definitions of public-private partnerships. The type that I'm talking here are not partnerships between the public and the private sector, in the sort of the philanthropic sense. What I'm talking about are contractual agreements between the public and the private sector to deliver a service or infrastructure over a period of time, where there are risks that are allocated to the parties that can best serve it, and where performance is incentivized and the private sector partner is paid according to the delivery and meeting of objectives and expected outcomes. So I hope that just sets the setting a bit more. Since the pandemic broke out almost a year ago to this date, or where we all started taking it seriously, because it had broken out about December, I think it was 2019 in Asia, suddenly we were all caught off guard, and there was a great concern and challenge about how we can find ways to use PPPs as a way to recover or to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. But the big struggle was that the procurement systems were very red tape filled, tied to procedures and that. And if you know a general process that it can take up to a year to procure a very large procurement, and there was a lot of frustration taking place. I also did a survey where I reached out to PPP practitioners from both the public and the private sector. And I had participants from 70 countries. And the one thing that almost was unanimously discussed was we have to find ways to expedite procurement. Because if we do it the old way, the pandemic's going to ravage our countries and our communities before we can even get anything launched. So we were caught off guard, as I said. We are mired in red tape. And the reality is, no matter which country in the world you live in, whether it was a very advanced country or whether it was a country that was still emerging or which was very, very limited with the resources that it had, is that we were mired in red tape, caught off guard, and governments belatedly started mobilizing resources. What was evident here in South Africa, where I come from originally, as well as in the United States and many other countries, there was a realization that we have to mobilize the resources of the private sector as well, because this is too big for the public sector to do on its own. So there were efforts being made to find ways to expedite and leverage the resources of the healthcare sector, but it could be other ones as well. There was generally a focus on healthcare, which I believe would serve as a model for other ways to expedite other needs. The pressing needs that have emerged is not just a healthcare, but also a broadband access, because now we've moved into a digital virtual world, and a lot of countries are behind on that curve. And then education. My wife's a teacher and she teaches now almost virtually. And so these were some of the challenges that have occurred. So, we can berate people and we can say you were caught off guard and you can't do anything and whatever. But I think one of the things is, was trying to explore ways to find out how we could be proactive and how we could be preemptive. I've had a lot of discussions and I have ongoing discussions, and there's a discussion that's taking place is, should we be focusing on the short term? Should we be focusing on the medium term? And should we be focusing on the long term? And I would say we need to focus on all. Short term would be, where we can come up with strategies or methods or approaches to expedite things very quickly. So for an example that happened here in the United States was the quick need to find partnerships with the private sector to distribute PPPs. This was not really a typical partnership where you'd think of a service or a infrastructure, but it was a good that was being provided. And so there were efforts to expedite those type of procurements because they needed it now. So this was sort of the proactive. But then there were also elements that one has had to explore is, how do we preempt? And that takes us into the medium and longer term. But one thing that is working very, very well, and you can see this just in the case of the vaccines that are being created around the world, is that when you form good public-private partnerships between the public and the private sector, there's innovation that is introduced that enhances the process or the solution that you're trying to find. And, as I was saying here, that, we can look at a philanthropic type of events, but as I wanted to say here, that I don't think you should consider a partnership with a philanthropy as a public-private partnership in the true sense. What you should be considering, though, is that there are philanthropic values and ideas and corporate social responsibility actions that can be incorporated into traditional PPP procurements, these contractually binding agreements. So I'm not bashing by any way, corporate social responsibility or philanthropy, but it is the ethos that it introduces or gap funding that it can produce, which helps get these projects off the ground. So one of the things that are necessary for conditions to have pandemic PPPs, and I would think, as we think in the longer term, not just pandemic, because there are going to be climate change challenges, there are political changes, there are wars, all sorts of things that can occur that are disruptive and have made, and which make the normal procurement process very difficult. There are certain conditions that need to be established. So one thing that's important is, we need to move into a regulatory environment or a legal system or a framework or guidelines, however you want to describe it, for PPPs that enhance incentivized procurement. There is, unfortunately, many times a sense, I think, from procurement officers around the world that, if a company is a really good partner in a PPP and it does extremely well, and then it starts making a bit more money out of it than was expected, that they are ripping off the society or they're ripping off the private sector. I mean, the public. I think one has to change that mindset, because a company that is running well and doing it well, and as long as it's providing the services that you required, if it makes a little bit of extra profit, that's an incentive for them to perform. If you take that away from them, they will lose their incentive. So one has to think carefully about that in procurements. What they do bring also is great efficiency and sustainability through efficient procurements. And this is where I want to stress one thing that is critically important. Efficient procurements have to be tied to competitive procurements and transparent procurements. You cannot have this unless it's an emergency procurement, and this does happen, where you can do a sole source procurement very quickly for emergency medical supplies or whatever, but that is typically going to take place with a reliable client or a reliable partner. What it allows, as I said, also is for the allocation of risk between the public and private partners. And this is a stumbling block for many, what you call it, governments, is that often they want to transfer all the risk to the private partner, and then that will lead to failure because the private partner can't handle every type of risk. You can think they are force majeure risks, or you can think of political risk. There are times that private sector partners would be willing to take on all the risk, but that should be a red flag, because that means that maybe they don't understand all the risks if they're just willing to take them, or they are going to charge a premium. And the problem also with the more risks that occur, which are allocated to one party, if it's to the private sector, the investors, the debtors, and the insurers are going to be a little concerned, and that means the rates are going to be much higher for debt, so the interest rates. So it is important to consider that as well. So it's really important that you manage appropriately and manage the responsibility. One thing, there's a myth that exists that when a PPP occurs, that the private sector will handle everything and the public sector can walk away and not worry for the next 10, 20, 30 years or whatever the duration of the contract is. That's a path or a recipe for disaster as well. I always encourage clients that I've worked with that when you launch a PPP program, that in your ministry or in your institution, that you create a unit of monitors that are going to support you as well. So, and they are going to keep an eye on the public sector. I mean, the private sector. The other thing that's also important is that the private sector find those counterparts in the public sector that they can work with. Sorry, I don't know, that went ahead, that they can work with. So we, I think I've lost, sorry. Okay. So we do need to work on this. And then, as I said, also link remuneration or compensation, which is really important, to the performance of the goods that are procured and the services and the works. It's not a swear word to do that. So there's a need for innovative approaches. And the important part is, finding techniques to procure, which are innovative and which maintain competitiveness and transparency. So, there are certain government institutions. In the United States, you have government institutions and think tanks, which are great sources of innovation. I know in China, that's the case as well, even in India. But in most situations, your biggest innovation is going to come from the private sector. And so if you are looking for ways to expedite procurements, reach out to the private sector and listen to them and ask them, what do they need? So many times governments are very prescriptive and they don't talk to the private sector, and then they launch a procurement and no one bids. And this has happened in many countries I've worked in. And then I always say to those people who are surprised is, did you even have a conversation with the private sector to ask what they need, what they're interested in? And the thing that's going to happen when you create public-private partnerships, the reality is that the public sector is going to have to think more like the private sector, and the private sector is going to have to start thinking more like the public sector. So you need to understand each other. And so you've got to be responsible to demonstrable ideas, the public sector. You can't just say, no, 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 or this is not the way we do it, because if you're doing that, then you shouldn't engage with the private sector if you're looking for innovative ways. As I said, also at the same time, the public sector needs to articulate its wants and needs. And it's also important that awards are made in a depoliticized environment. And what I mean by that is no favoritism, no quick procurements that go to the president's son's granddaughter's friend's cousin type of thing. The only way you are going to have effective and innovative and fast procurements is if you're doing it in a competitive and transparent way. And by this, I mean that you're going to have procurements that are going to be sustainable, or projects that are going to be sustainable and resilient. So some of the best practices that can be introduced, to expedite procurement best practices, that there needs to be a national PPP platform. Some countries have them, some don't. And that lists the critical needs that have been identified based on the crisis. And these could also be critical needs that are identified and tied to, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals of countries. But it also needs to take subnational government situations into consideration as well. So this requires coordination and harmonization between the national government and the subnational government. And you need to identify specific priorities that can be shared with the private sector. And this means that you need to initiate a triage priority action. And what I mean by that is what projects are absolutely critical that we can move forward and which will succeed, and which are going to serve the purpose for which they were intended. You found in the United States last year that the central government didn't take a very good lead and left everything pretty much to subnational or state governments. And the result of it is that government started competing against one another for limited resources and it stalled. So I would say coordinate, coordinate, coordinate if you want to come up with the best procurement list. And if you create a pipeline that is open and transparent and everyone can see it, you are going to get good responses. If you have tools that can mobilize the private sector under legislative acts and executive orders, such as here as we have in the United States, the US War Production Act, that's a way to expedite. But again, it means you do have to make sure that the companies that you're entering into these agreements with are able to deliver. In the United States, there were countless stories, and I know in other countries as well, of companies that were hired under public-private partnerships to deliver goods or services that had no expertise, no background history, and for whatever reason, they were hired and it was a disaster. So we need to avoid that. So we need to ensure so that we are generally in compliance with emergency guidelines that exist. And I would say that, you know, if it's an emergency, use your best knowledge and your best intentions in an ethical way to make it possible for procurements to be slightly fast-tracked. And this doesn't mean fast-tracking means just giving projects to anyone. They still have to follow rules on that. And if these fast-tracking mechanisms or rules don't exist, that means that you might have to revisit some of your national PPP procurement laws to make sure that it makes it possible. Because you don't want to go through a process of expediting an innovative procurement and then launching it, and then somebody like the national regulator or the national, what you call it, auditing body or whatever says, we're canceling it because you didn't follow the rules. And there were cases in the United States where many of these contracts were canceled because the rules weren't followed and they were dubious. Other things that need to do is, I think that a country should need to, or should look more at digital procurement interfaces. This will help, because if we have old paper trails and that, it's very difficult to track. And if you are suddenly swamped with a tremendous amount of new projects that have to be critically procured through PPPs, it's good to have it in a procurement system, because you're creating the database and the information and the monitoring systems as you go, and it's there. You don't have to do the paperwork and then have somebody methodically entering it. It just takes too much time. I think one of the things that's also important, and I've talked about this, is that you need to make sure that you can verify partners' offerings and prevent nefarious attempts by unscrupulous parties to participate. And this is particularly of importance with what they refer to as unsolicited proposals, USPs. This is when the private sector comes to the government and says, we've got something you need. And the government, you know, can and should entertain this and have a look at it. But it doesn't mean that the government, once it's considering an unsolicited proposal, that it is, how would I describe it, going to do it as a procurement. The other thing, it's also important that it should be very important, or people should be cognizant of that unsolicited proposals are not used as a mechanism to bypass projects in the pipeline. So if there's a project that's already existing and it's being procured, no one should be able to come along with a USP and say, I've got a deal for you, because it just, you know, it takes away the competitiveness and the transparency away. So, you know, we need to red tape that needs to be done. And then, you know, we need to recruit public and private sector technical and procurement experts so that they understand it. My experience is that the vast majority of procurements for PPPs that are done in countries that are done by procurement officers who don't have much of a PPP background. And what happens there is that they are forced into this by their bosses and told, you will procure a PPP, and that is a recipe for disaster. So, you know, capacity building of your PPP procurement experts is a possibility. And if you are only going to launch one or two and you don't want to hire up, then, you know, hire new staff, then there's a process I would think it's important is hire some technical experts for that procurement. You know, I've talked about, you know, we don't want to, you know, that they can be fast tracked. That's important. One of the things that I would suggest, you know, if a project is meritorious and you decide to move it forward, that you do still compete it. For those who haven't heard of it, you know, take a look for what is referred to as the Swiss method. And if you just typed in PPP Swiss method or PPP Swiss procurement method, you will find that it exists. I mean, you'll find information that you can use. You know, the longer term and larger procurements, you know, are going to be the more complex. And the reason for that is because you are going to rely heavily on, how would I describe it? Very complex projects that, especially if it's for infrastructure services, that are going to have complex financial models in that. So a long-term PPP procurement should not be speeded as far as I'm concerned, you know, because there's just too much that has to happen. Unfortunately, if you're going to do a long-term PPP project, the procurement process can take easily up to a year and even longer to do it if you're going to do it efficiently. So that's why I mentioned earlier on, as you start developing your PPP procurement strategies for pandemic responses or natural disaster responses, that you need to have short, medium, and long-term considerations. The one that's become incredibly important is how you're going to address force majeure. And by force majeure, I think you all know what I mean by that. It's referred to often as an act of God or an act of nature, something out of the control of the projects. There were instances when the pandemic occurred that many governments said, well, we're going to hold the private sector fully responsible for everything, even though the best projects faced distress. You know, for example, the airports in Dubai, which are kind of PPPs, they had a massive drop-off in users. And so there were financial stresses. And the question was, you know, would we allow a project like that to fail by just blaming the private sector and making them pay up? Or were we going to reach agreements where we could look at the force majeure and see what agreements we could reach that would enable or ensure the project did not fail? Taking an adversarial position at this time was not a good one. And for all the lawyers who are listening in, I apologize. But one thing that we have to start considering for projects of this nature in the future is flexibility, however you can build it into the contract so that there are not punitive measures that are implemented against the contractee when it's not their fault. And I think, you know, that we're also going to have to look at the long-term work, service, and goods that have to be added filters to ensure that they are sustainable and resilient. So my request or plea to everyone is start thinking about how you can build sustainability and resilience into your procurement contracts as well. Because you're not just thinking about the procurement as such, you know, you should be thinking about the long term. I've had many people have said to me, you know, wonderful, we've just done our first PPP. And I asked, well, what did you do? Well, we closed the contract. And I said, well, so it took you 3 years to get to this position. What about the next 27 years of a contract? Because, you know, typical PPPs on average about 30 years in duration. And I said, oh, you know, we really didn't think about that. So what you have to build into your procurements and your innovative procurements as well is flexibility and strategies or agreements on how you're going to handle the unknown and the unexpected. Let me just see what's happened here. Okay. So in conclusions, you know, these big events, I don't know if you've heard of the term, but they are often referred to as black swan events. It is likely, because the world is under tremendous stress, that these might become the norm, that we'll have it. You know, you would say, well, that's crazy. Even in the United States, people might say that'd be crazy. But if you think of the Gulf region a few years ago, for 3 years in a row, the Gulf region was hit by hurricanes, which was supposed to be 1,000-year events and actually became every year events. So you need to think of how can we innovate? Do we have a fast-tracking procurement system in our country, in our state, in our local city government that allows still competitive and transparent procurements, but it takes away the unnecessary to respond in the short term immediately what we need to do, have a longer term context, as well as a mitigation and recovery long-term context as well. We need to have robust and resilient PPP procurement systems, as I mentioned. One thing I think is critically important is to develop strategies that are user-friendly and that enhance these partnerships between the public and private sector. This is the time for institutions, specifically the public sector, to sit down and rethink, what does the word partnership mean? Is it just, you know, a contract? This is more than a contract. PPP is almost like marriages, you know, where you're going to enter into a long-term agreement and you have two things that can happen: a disastrous divorce that leads to tremendous problems and challenges, or you can have a situation where you can find every way to make the marriage last and it be a good and productive one. And what you want to have is, you know, our ultimate outcome that is, you know, basically is looking at ways to ensure that needed services, infrastructure and goods are procured, even if it is necessary at mammoth scale or at giant scale during the pandemic outbreaks. It can be done. in my discussions with organizations around the world and governments, they are doing it. Some are hesitant, some are resistant, but I think those that are embracing these challenges and turning them into opportunities are having a greater time. As was mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, I do blog and write, thought leadership ideas, maybe too much, but I wanted to share some of them that I've written with you, that I've written. Ones that you might find, and you can find this on my LinkedIn account. It's freely accessible. When I create these things, I want to find ways to help people and governments and practitioners in the world. But the one that was referred to about last week is the World Bank published 20 blogs on COVID that had been published over the last year from March to March. And somehow I seem to have been a pioneer. I wrote the very first one, and it was very kind of them to introduce it in the list of the 20. I also have written numerous ones that you can easily access on LinkedIn, the need for a triage recovery, and that has been taken up on a few papers that have been published in journals. There is the survey that I mentioned. You can see that I'm running across the top from left to right. Then ideas on force majeure if you're struggling with it, recovery strategies that are sustainable, proactive strategic pandemic healthcare PPPs, that what we can do about pragmatic solicitations and also unsolicited proposals, expediting procurements through healthcare services, etc., the coronavirus and de-risking PPPs, and I can go on and on, but these exist out there, and I would say, take the chance, read them, and reach out to Tuman and me, and we can always, provide answers and help you out. And that is all I have to say at this moment. I hope that there will be questions, and I hope I can answer your questions. But you can see where you can contact me, or you can contact me through the sponsor of this event as well. So thank you very much. So I don't know how to undo screen sharing.
David, that's okay. So Elizabeth, we have some questions. You want to go ahead?
Yes, the one for Vincent, I'll actually, since we have some time, if Vincent can unmute and ask the question. It's a comment and a question.
David, I think you are on mute, and there is a question in the chat window or Q&A window.
Okay, I'm not on mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you are on video.
I can hear you.
Turn the video on.
Okay, let me turn on video. There we are. Can you see me? Okay.
Yes, we can see you now. So there's a question by James Vincent. There are normally tensions, as mentioned by David, between NPPA and the National Auditor General's Office. This is evident in emergencies like in our own case in Sierra Leone, the mudslide, the Ebola, and now COVID-19 pandemic. What can be done to smoothen the relationship and tensions between two national institutions?
So I think, in the first place, and this is what I've advised a number of countries to do, is to look very carefully at the PPP laws and are they harmonized, for example, with the national procurement laws. They definitely need to be. One thing that we have to acknowledge and realize that PPP procurements is really just a subset of national procurements. So there would always be, specific procurement practices that have to be followed, no matter what type of project it is. And then you can have an addendum or extra articles that are added to the law, which cover PPPs as well, but they should never be seen as two separate beasts, if you can call it that, because that will result in tensions and both different, interest groups saying, well, you didn't follow the rules or whatever. The important thing is also, as countries move forward to try and expedite their procurement practices, it's important that all parties talk. So that means that, you need to, if it's a healthcare ministry one, the healthcare ministry should still also be talking to the Treasury. It should be talking to the National Procurement Authority. It should also ensure that its practices are in alignment with, how would I describe it? With the, that they are in alignment with the law as such. The challenge obviously is going to be is when there's an emergency, do you have to then go to Parliament, or does the president, for example, have the power to issue an executive order to make it happen? You don't want to create enemies within the government at different levels of government. You want to create partners, and you want to create willing partners. And so this is important, that if you're not having cross government stakeholder discussions, that you need to start having them, because the best ideas can be stopped by parties that just don't understand what you're talking about. And I think with the PPPs as general also, there needs to be a stronger education in non-PPP functions or non-PPP organizations, what a public-private partnership it really is. I hope that helps.
There was a question from there, but I don't see it anymore. Vera, do you want to ask the question? She's from Nigeria. I saw it in the chat, but it's not there anymore.
That was about the program, so I think I answered that one.
Okay.
So if there are any questions, you can raise your hands, or you can type in the chat window or Q&A. Parshu, do you have any questions? I know you all usually have.
Yes, actually, David, very good to see you again. Thanks for coming on, regularly, as and when we require you. Thank you very much. Actually, my question is kind of a very broad question on PPP, then the procurement specific. I'm a student of procurement, PPP, though I have heard about this PPP for quite a long time, I should say. But can you give me a little bit historic context as to when it all started, and how many countries are adopting PPP, and in like how many countries there are laws, regulations, and in the supervisory system in place, how many countries are behind? And on the same topic, and which sectors, which economic sectors are more PPP friendly, health, education, or agriculture? Just, it's a lot of questions blended. I hope I wasn't unfair to you. If you could, summarize, briefly on these.
Okay, so, historically, the British claim in the 1980s that they started working with PPPs, but there are historic examples of PPPs that are hundreds of years old. People say historically that the first public-private partnerships were formed during the time of the Roman Empire, where, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, there were agreements to, between private citizens and the government to provide services on that. More recent ones, historically, the Dutch government in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. So anyone who lives in Africa or Sri Lanka, southern India, and those parts, and Indonesia, there was the company called the Dutch East India Company, which was an agreement between merchants and the Dutch government to bring spices and that to Europe. But every one of those ships also could serve as an auxiliary warship if war broke out. So the Dutch Navy had free ships. My great-grandfather, which is a very interesting, my great-great-grandfather, he worked on one of the most successful and oldest PPPs in history, which was the Suez Canal. That was an agreement between the Suez Company and the government of Egypt and debtors and investors from all over the world to build the canal and operate it. And so it goes on and on. But typically, you know, in the 1980s, there was a renewed interest in public-private partnerships, started in the UK. We hear under the leadership of Prime Minister Thatcher, when the government realized that it was sitting on a lot of infrastructure that it could, and they used the word privatize, but really it wasn't privatized, but it could be reorganized. And this took off all over the world. I'm very proud to say that, you know, South Africa, for example, created one of the first major PPP units in the world. So it wasn't even just something that happened in Europe, it happened in Africa, which has formed as the basis or served as the basis for PPP guidance. And those of you who are grappling with PPPs and trying to understand how to implement them and understand how they work, and especially maybe in an African context, it would be worthwhile for you to go to the South African Treasury website and have a look at their PPP guidance. It's readily available and it's very systematic and well written. You asked the question on the sectors that have, you know, emerged in the survey that I did, which I pointed out to you on my presentation. When I asked which sectors have suffered the most under the pandemic and which sectors offer the most promise as we move into a post-pandemic world. It was interesting that transportation suffered the most, and you can just think of the airports that were shut down, the transportation in, you know, here in Washington, DC, the metro has struggled to survive, you know, so it was transportation in general. But ironically, the sector that had the most potential in the future in a post-pandemic world was also mentioned as the what you call transportation sector again, and that was strange. So I asked, and what they were saying was that they need to start looking more heavily at smart transportation or sustainable transportation. So what you're having a look is some of the sectors might exist, but some of the sectors are now going to be reinvented and restructured. And this is why we need to have innovative procurements to address that. Ones that stood out, the sectors as ones that offer the greatest potential, are those that are still going to be needed. So in dry countries, it's always still going to be water and sanitation PPPs. But then there were ones that were based on digital infrastructure. That's risen in prominence. And that, you know, involves bringing broadband services to communities that are struggling to have access to economic activity, for example. I'm involved in a project that's in Africa as well as in Mexico, where they're looking at bringing broadband to small businesses, especially women-owned businesses, which have struggled because they haven't been able to carry out commercial activity because of the pandemic. Education, obviously, is still going to be critically important as they have to rebuild and redesign schools so that they have healthier environments. And then the last one I would say, which is obvious, especially in emerging economies, are the healthcare PPPs. So I hope that, Parashul, that was a long answer to a long question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David. Now you have a couple more questions here, David, on the chat window.
Okay.
I'm just going to read one, just it's not in any order. So by Charan Singh. Hey, David, you mentioned a lot about enhancing innovation within the procurement processes. What do you believe especially need to be introduced by the private sector to enhance the process? Also, does the entire process need to be reconfigured moving forward? So that's the question for you.
Okay.
That's $1 million question.
Yeah, and hi Charan, I know Charan well. So one of the questions or things that definitely needs is going to be looking at, and I've heard more and more of this, and Charan and I've had these discussions as well, is the whole idea of how can you use blockchains to improve procurement. What you want to do is have a very robust procurement system that is verifiable, it's secured, can't be manipulated, and which, you know, creates an ongoing record of everything that has happened. It's a new field that's emerging. So when people are talking about e-procurement systems, I think more and more people are also beginning to talk about, you know, e-procurement systems that have sort of a blockchain aspect behind it. The other is the whole idea of smart contracts. And that's still also very debatable what a smart contract is. But these are contracts that are interactive, live, Every action that takes place is verified. So if somebody strays off the track, doesn't deliver what they're supposed to be doing, this contract would pick it up. I always laugh. I was working once with some people, and there was this project in Central America, and it was a power project, and it was running very, very well. And so it provided electricity reliably. It provided electricity at a good cost. So all parties were happy, and the government never bothered to check the contract, and the private sector operator either chose not to check it or didn't check it themselves, because this was like 30 years previously that the contract had been signed. And then a smart, young, new employee of the government came along, and he was, in his job, he decided to read contracts, just to understand which contracts were in place. And there he found out, which was fascinating, that the project had actually ended 5 years before, and no one knew that it had ended, that this PPP project was ongoing. And that caused quite a lot of people being rather startled, because you had a situation that the private sector had actually benefited from extending the contract without having to re-procure it. So if you look at smart contract systems, this type of thing would never have happened, because one of the biggest challenges, obviously, of finding people who are going to manage the contracts in the public sector side. As I said, it's not something you put on the shelf and in 30 years' time you knock on the person's door or the private sector partner's door and say, thank you, great job, time up, okay, and we're done. You have to monitor it at all times.
Thank you. I have two more questions. The first one says, what are the most important steps to do or follow when initiating PPPs procurement projects?
Okay. So that's a really good question. And I think the first one is that the initiator or the proponent really needs to make sure that they know what a PPP is in the first place. I've had many times where I've worked in governments where somebody said, well, let's just do a PPP. And, everyone is like, what is a PPP? Or, how do we do a PPP? That's the first thing. The second thing is, understanding what the constraints are of a PPP initiation process. Is it supported by the law? Are there certain guidelines and requirements? Because if they are, you need to ensure that those are also considered. The third thing, it is critically important to understand what the desired or expected outcomes are. You cannot have a PPP project if you don't know what is going to be required, what is expected. And so this will become the foundation of the terms of reference that have to be included in a PPP. So things that you're going to have to do is, have a vision, come up with objectives. The other is, importantly, which is one area that's often not done very well, is do pre-feasibility and feasibility studies to ensure, and this is the important things, that the project is going to be commercially and economically viable. Also that the project is bankable. And by that, I mean, will there be creditors or debtors, if you want to call it, that are even interested in investing in the project? Because if you put out a project that's not bankable, you're not going to get support. And this involves the whole concept of doing an analysis for value for money. As countries are also now facing these pandemics and environmental crises that exist, another area that is critically important is, and I haven't talked about this, but I think it's a good one, is there value for people in the project? Are you going to offer something that's going to uplift countries and help them achieve their sustainable development goals? And another aspect that I think is critically important is value for the future. Are you going to future-proof projects by designing them well? So there are a number of steps, but it's the vision, the understanding, finding the stakeholders that are going to support it. Is it legal? Does it follow the country's norms and that? And you can create a checklist like that. And if anyone wants ever to ask me, I can provide them with a checklist. But once you've done that checklist, then only should you start a procurement. Don't discover these things and try and do them while the procurement is happening, because it's going to be a disaster. You need to have this very, very clearly defined before you even start the procurement. And you have to ask yourself that one critical question. Is the project that I'm proposing a PPP project? Sometimes, surprisingly enough, you might come up with the answer and say, there's no ways we can do it as a PPP project. And that's good. Rather say no than get trapped and have a very bad project that fails and, you know, drags everyone down. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. Another question is, what are the considerations for small island developing states?
Okay, that's an interesting one because I'm working on a project in the Maldives at the moment, and that is a small island state. I think the considerations there is, because the resources are very limited of small island states, is, you know, don't go too big and be too ambitious, because that could result in you bankrupting your country. PPP still costs money. They're not free money. So you need to ensure that you do have sort of a prioritized list that all stakeholders and different government agencies and ministries agree that this is one that is good. The other is, for example, in a situation like the Maldives, it is extremely tourist focused and dependent. And I would say is that, you know, try and find ways to adopt or follow PPPs that are going to diversify your economy and make your economy more robust. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, because if you do that, you could have a situation that, for example, if the tourism industry collapses, and the Maldives experienced it, I think about 80% of the economy directly or indirectly was reliant on tourism, you have a disaster. And it wasn't anyone's fault in the Maldives, that's just a reality. And you've seen that, you know, Hawaii, for example, not a small island state, but it's a state of the United States, suffered tremendously. The Seychelles, Mauritius, you can go down the list. So diversification when you have a national PPP program is important. You also need to, specifically because of the precarious nature of these countries when it comes to climate change, rising sea levels, and that, focus on projects that are definitely going to be sustainable and resilient. So build better roads, build higher roads, you know, build infrastructure that's going to protect you against flooding, for example, those type of projects.
Thank you. So we'll take one last question, and then the ones that we're running out of time, I'll make sure we'll email you the answers back. So the last question is, what is the most appropriate mechanism to manage the ownership of completed PPP projects?
Okay, that's an interesting one. Okay, so, you know, what's interesting is that PPP governments often forget that when a PPP project is completed, they still own it. You know, if in almost every instance, that facility is being operated and maintained and built by an operator with the intention that after 20 years or 30 years, it's going to be given back to the public sector. And in many instances, the public sector doesn't think about that, and they forget that. In Eastern Europe, there's some very good examples. I think everyone remembers when the Iron Curtain collapsed and the wall came down in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And many of these Eastern European countries rushed into public-private partnerships because they needed to find alternative financing that they didn't have. And the result of that was that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of PPPs, some good, a lot crazy, that were initiated. And they all suddenly started coming mature in the last year or two from now, because it's 30 years on from that event. And many governments, and I spoke to governments in that region, of saying, we don't know what to do. We're getting all these projects back. We don't want them back. And we don't have the resources to manage all these projects that are coming back to us. And the question then was being asked, you know, should we privatize? So that's going out from the public's pipe or the PPP section. You know, should we privatize it? Should we re-procure it? And I would say that the critical importance is that governments, before they launch into it, do they have a plan, not an exit plan when they hand it over to the private sector, but do they have an onboarding plan to handle these projects when they come back to them? And have they considered that, and do they understand that as a reality? And if they do have that plan, are they going to go the next step and take it to privatization? Or are they going to take it back and run it as a state-owned enterprise? Or are they going to re-procure it? And the only way I would say important that if you're going to re-procure it and it's run well by that operator, I would give them some procurement credit points so that other companies really have to compete against them to prove that they can do it better. Because my sense is if you have one if you have one operator that's done a good job for 30 years, yes, you have to open it up because of your procurement laws to an open procurement, but you do want to give, opportunities for others to innovatively bid and come up with new ideas. But if the good operator is a good one, you might want to enter into a renewed PPP contract for another 30 years. So it's all about policy understanding. But please, if you're in the government and you haven't thought about what's going to happen when all these projects come back to you, you need to start thinking very quickly about it. 20 years, 30 years goes by very, very quickly.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left.
So David, I have one question.
Okay,
yes.
Go ahead.
So my question, actually, I was going to ask a question on capacity building, but a very similar question has come here from Resam Kanel from Syracuse University, saying in order for success of PPP projects, both contracting parties, government and private sector, should have enough capacity, equal capacity to do the projects. But in developing countries, either private sectors are not competent enough, or sometimes the government doesn't have enough capacity. So in order to do that, what do you advise? What's your advice to make PPP successful in that case?
Okay. So the challenge is for a ministry in a country, an emerging economy, that it could be their first PPP or their second or their only PPP that they're ever going to do. And then the question that always is arising, should we ramp up and have, do a lot of training for launching a PPP procurement? I would say yes, to a certain degree, but ramp up to, focus on the operations and maintenance monitoring of the project afterwards, because you can always hire somebody to do the procurement as such. But the side that you touched on, Suman, which is really important, is it's critically important that the private sector be encouraged to train their staff in PPPs as well, because in many countries there is very, very little domestic capability to compete on PPPs. So it will always, it seems, and this causes a lot of unhappiness, go to outside international companies instead of domestic companies that don't have a chance to build up their capability. So I was involved in some initiatives in countries where the government initiated a capacity building program, but to make it work and to get both parties involved in that, the government initiated these programs for both the public and the private sector together at the same time. And this was amazing, watching groups from both sides interact and train and hear the same message at the same time, because then they could hear, the concerns from the other side or understand the other side better. And it created I think, a better pool of skilled PPP practitioners in that country, both on the public and the private sector, who understood it better. So that's a consideration.
Thanks, David. That's what I thought,
Thank you
because
so much.
many times these countries have private sector which doesn't have enough capacity, and they don't really focus on building their internal capacity, and they don't win this project. It goes for external contractors, That's a big loss. I think some countries, I can quote India, has done a good job in last 20, 30 years, and now it's showing up the results. So anyway, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining in. I just can't emphasize enough. Look out for emails from Elizabeth. Now you know who she is. And Elizabeth, you want to announce the procurement program that's coming up pretty soon?
Yes.
And then we do closing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So we have a training coming up in May, the World Bank Procurement Training Program. I will send an email out to everyone who attended this training. If you're interested, you can please apply. If you have questions regarding today's webinar and those questions that we skipped because we ran out of time, I will make sure you get them answered.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. And so we have a quarterly procurement training, and I see lots of our alumni had joined in today. That's a really good thing. And they were just to David's last answer. I think 20% of them were David from private sectors. They were from engineering companies or some other telecom companies, So that was really satisfying seeing that those countries, from certain countries, the private sector people were joining those trainings, And look out for PPP training coming up soon for June with those words. I'm not sure if Percy is online. So with those words, thank you very much from IDI, and we'll be seeing you soon in next webinars, whenever it is. Thank you. Thank you,
Next
David.
month.
Thank you for
Thank you.
everything.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.